half Dutch, and half Venezuelan. And went to, like Stefan said, went to Georgetown University, got my undergraduate in international politics. I had a dream of joining the State Department and really being a foreign service officer. But because of security clearances and things like that, I realized that I could have the same career, but in the private sector, and really be an advocate for a company. And so I did my master's as well at Georgetown, did it in global business and finance. And after that is when I was recruited by Chevron. And the international energy space, it's fascinating. It combines everything that I was learning at Georgetown, from the intersection of politics to trade, to really sort of how countries interact with each other, because energy is key to the world. And so I've been able to rotate in Texas, in Argentina, and then in different cities like Austin, Houston, etc. So covering different regions from the US all the way to Africa and the Middle East. And so that's a bit about me.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Guillermo. We are very excited to have you here. I think this is a great opportunity for students to not just learn about the energy policy, the energy sector, but also to see that working in international affairs is a very diverse field. You're not just constricted to working in government. Not that there's anything wrong with working in government, but there are very different experiences in this field.
Yeah.
So,
and to add to that, working on the private sector side, especially in a multinational energy company, you're interacting with the government all the time. And so if eventually you want to enter into the government space, be it at an institution like the UN, be it the State Department, you can really make a lot of connections in the private sector, because we're working with both the US government and international governments all the time. They're really a key partner in what enables us to be able to operate and provide, affordable, reliable, and ever cleaner energy to the world.
So on that point, Guillermo, what is it like? What do companies have to gain by having people with your type of knowledge? What are some of the hurdles that companies must face?
Yeah, that's a really good question, because at least I can speak for the company that I work for. I think when we come with an international relations or an international politics background, you can really provide a perspective that an engineering company like Chevron might not have. Stakeholders nowadays have more and more expectations from companies, from positions on social issues to positions of geopolitics. And really where a skill set of ours comes in is helping to protect the company's license to operate on everything that's the above ground risk that you could be facing. And that could be things from, an issue in a local area with local stakeholders when you're starting a new project, to when you're renewing a license in a country like Kazakhstan, for example. The engineers are very good at the process side of it, at sort of how do we get oil out of the ground or gas out of the ground. But where we come in is really to provide that perspective of what can we say to the minister, what are the positions of the president, and really help shape the messaging around that to ensure that we get the best possible outcome for the company, but also for the country where we're operating in.
So how 'cause it seems like it's a very multi-dimensional aspect of working in international affairs. You have to deal with multiple players, all with multiple interests. So beyond the Chevron pedigree, how are you able to insert yourselves into that conversation?
Can you give me an example, Stefan?
So like, how are you able to go to um, let's say Saudi Arabia, and say, hey, Saudi Arabia, we have some thoughts about the energy sector. We want to talk to you, and we think that maybe these policies might be useful. How do you get the government to really consider your policy recommendations?
That's a good question, and it's one of those that I, coming into the sector or coming into a company like this, I could ask myself that, and how does it really work? But what I learned to realize as time went on is that I joined the company that has more than 100 years of experience, and a company that really values itself as a partner of choice when it comes to the sector. We're actively working with people, and where you get that dialogue, from what I've seen, and that sort of trust, is by being available when those sorts of conversations are needed, by being a resource. And we're actively a partner with stakeholders, and we actively look to just say, hey, do you need help on this? Like, certain governments, certain countries don't have the technology expertise for developing certain things like a Chevron has. And so when you can show that you're a good faith partner, not just when you need something, but actively managing the relationship and just being available, that's where you really establish sort of that two-way dialogue that leads to very positive business outcomes and for recommendations that can be implemented. We see it as well in everything that's the new energy space, with the energy transition and everything that's going on. Those are conversations that are being had, that you have a certain group of stakeholders viewing it one way, but if you insert yourself into the conversation and sort of show the economics and like what's going on, you can really help shape and understand that we are transitioning right now, and there are certain things that we need before we arrive to the outcomes that everybody wants, which is a cleaner and greener world.
So I understand you have a presentation for us, a few
Yeah.
slides that you want to share. Before I get to that, though, I just want to ask you one question, because I feel it may add a another dimension to the presentation. And that question is, who would you say is actually at the heart of crafting the energy policy? Would you say it's the government? Would you who actually creates the policy? Would you say it's the companies who actually make the infrastructure, like Chevron, or is it like the average people who consumes the energy, as in the people who comprise the market?
The great thing about the sector is that really most things are driven by the market, and companies respond to market forces. Where you can see influence occurring and where companies in the market adapt is when either multinational institutions or governments set policy. And when governments set policy, you have to adapt and find the best business case or adapt your business to continue operating in the country. And that's why it's so important to have a two-way dialogue, because when policymakers propose new ways of looking at a market, you can really help be part of a dialogue and come out with a constructive outcome to all of that. So, simply put, the market decides everything, but governments can influence what the market looks like.
Wonderful, wonderful. So at this step, we're gonna head up to the presentation. I just want to take a quick moment here to mention something administratively. So after the presentation, we are going to open up the floor to questions. And the way you can submit your question is, if you can send me a private message with your question. I'll work on organizing those. So, because I really want this to be more than just a Q&A, I'd love to turn this into a conversation. So I'm going to try to group questions together. And when it's time to when it's time to ask your question, I will call on you, and I ask that you please unmute your microphone so that you can talk with Guillermo directly. At the end of the event, we are then going to take a group photo. So make sure you don't miss that. It will be posted on our website. In case you haven't noticed, we've also been recording this. This session is going to be posted on YouTube. So you guys are welcome to go back and take a listen because we've already learned quite a lot about international affairs and the energy sector, and I know that there's a lot more to come. So with that in mind, Guillermo, can you tell us a little bit about the report that I believe that you are going to be discussing about today while I share my screen and pull up the presentation?
Yeah, and no, again, thank you for the invite to speak. And sort of as Stefan was saying, I mean, today we want to make it very interactive, and I'm presenting myself as, it's Guillermo who happens to work for Chevron. So all of the views that I'm expressing today, it's my sort of perspectives on the energy sector, but also want to highlight the International Energy Agency. They're a great institution who does a lot of publishing at the international level on energy sector data, and they really help companies where I work at to understand what are the trends, what can we be seeing, and sort of where the market is heading. And every year they publish what's called the World Energy Outlook. And if anybody on the call is interested in the energy sector and sort of like what transition looks like, where are certain technologies heading, this is the report to look at. And so we've included a link to it at the end of the presentation. Unfortunately, we're going to be talking about the 2021 report because the 2022 one gets published in the October-November timeframe. And so, if you liked today's report, then you have some good reading coming up next month or in the next month and a half.
Wonderful. So here we are in the first slide.
Yeah, Stefan, if we can go back, please, to the intro slide. So yeah, I don't know if we want to make it interactive like this, Stefan, or if we just wait for people to talk at the end. But I just wanted to ask: does anybody know what this is? Like this sort of large piece of infrastructure?
Feel free to raise your hand.
Sorry.
Tarek, yeah, why don't you go?
Yeah. Oh, hi. And good morning, everyone. It's an offshore drilling rig for oil.
Yes, exactly. So this is and I don't. Sorry, what's your name?
It's Taruk Wheeler. Nice to meet you.
Thank you, Taruk. So Taruk is 100% right. This is our sort of newest acquisition that we have at Chevron. We recently, Chevron recently purchased Noble Energy, and they have assets in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is the Leviathan field. It's one of the Leviathan platform that drills into the Leviathan field. And it's one of the largest natural gas fields in the world today. And it's really, with everything that's going on in Europe, it's going to be a key source of energy, or could be a key source of energy for to provide Europe with natural gas and some energy security. So next slide, please. Thanks, Stefan. So I work for Chevron, and something that really attracted me about the company is it's not, I don't see it as sort of the traditional energy companies. Some of them, they're all great, but some of them have some views that don't necessarily align with what I see as where the future is heading. And at the company, we really know that sort of affordable and reliable energy really is the enabler to modern life. There's currently an energy transition going on, but it really has to work for all. As the energy transition keeps happening, we'll see prices continue to rise, and that's energy prices continue to rise. And that's where sort of natural gas and oil and some of the products we make, it helps stabilize prices as we continue in the transition. But at the company, they really believe, energy is essential. It's what's enabled human progress in the last 100 years. I mean, the life that we have today, most of the products that we use in our day-to-day, I mean, I remember before joining the industry, I had no idea, but literally most of what we use today is derived from some piece of the hydrocarbons chain. And that has enabled the world we live in today. And a lot of the low prices that we see, a lot of the reason why things are very affordable is because of just the abundance of this resource and how we've been able to use it. The company also believes in protecting the environment. We have something called the Chevron Way, and it's one of the founding documents of the company, sort of the tenets of how we operate. And really, it's about making sure that we protect air, water, land, and climate in wherever we're operating in. And we also support a carbon price. That's for governments to decide what it looks like, but a price on carbon really helps with the externalities and that sort of emissions that have occurred over time in the industry. And finally, we believe that innovation is going to meet society's challenges. I mean, from manufacturing to agriculture, electricity, and transport, we're seeing how the world has innovated already. I mean, we're seeing that with solar technologies, with wind technologies, but innovation, partnership, it's what's going to get us through in the coming years. So that's sort of what we believe in. Next slide, please. The company is also involved in every part of the energy sector. And so Chevron is what's considered a integrated oil and gas company. And by integrated, it's that we operate throughout the whole oil and gas value chain. So the upstream side, that's what Taruk had mentioned in the picture. That's where we explore and drill, so produce oil and natural gas. Midstream is when you see the large ships that either carry liquid natural gas or carry oil or refined products. That's the supply and transport of that. And finally, the downstream is where we refine and market a lot of the products made from oil and natural gas. And that includes, a feedstock for plastics, gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, a lot of the components that we take for granted that really enable the life we live today. The other thing that's not pictured on this slide is new energies. So we, for example, are looking at partnerships with solar companies to help reduce our carbon footprint of our operations. We, at a time, were producing geothermal energy, and our research groups really develop technologies that can help sort of reduce the carbon footprint of our operations. So the company ChargePoint, for example, they're an electric car charging company. Chevron is an investor in that because we're always looking at technologies that can help move the world forward. So we're in a lot of the energy sector. Next slide, please. And that's why I wanted to talk about that. I mean, advancing a lower carbon future. And that's something we're really focused on, from our operations to our day-to-day. Like, we understand that climate change is real, and we understand that it's, man-made. And that's where, as an industry, or at least as a company, we're really focused on lowering our carbon intensity and growing our lower carbon business. For example, we've committed $10 billion through 2028 to invest in hydrogen technologies, looking at carbon capture and underground storage, looking at geothermal, all of these things that can really help in the energy transition, because we want to help drive, measurable progress and show that we are making improvements. So that's all going to help really with we really want to make energy and global supply chains sort of more sustainable, so that other industries and our customers who use our products can also help improve and make a lower carbon world. So next slide, please. So that's a bit about Chevron. Now we're working into the the energy report. But does anybody have any questions on what we saw? Sort of any questions on what the energy transition looks like for the company, like what upstream means, midstream, all that?
I have one question as far as, so like with these new emerging technologies with solar and wind and hydropower getting, less expensive and us being able to store it, these countries that fully rely on, petroleum, such as Nigeria, look at Venezuela, the Middle East is transitioning in the United Arab Emirates. But how is Chevron as a company, if that transition happened faster than sooner, how would you not exit a company or country, but maybe take a country with you instead of, just because they wouldn't have that technology class of resource? Obviously, sun is everywhere, but
right.
Yeah.
And that's a super interesting question. So for us, where we really try to be the partner of choice in different countries where we operate. And we do operate in Nigeria, we operate in Venezuela. But those sort of decisions are made by the government. And so where they're invited by them to produce their resources, if they decide that they no longer want that production and they no longer want us as a partner, we really can't do anything about that. And so we're going to work with our partner, our equivalent, so their national oil company or their petroleum regulator, and really just be there for when they want us, how they want us. But we're just seeking to be a partner of choice for them.
Thank you.
Thanks, Farouk. Anybody else? All right. So, like I was saying earlier, this report, at least for me, I'm going to nerd out here, this is personal, but it's one of the best resources for the future outlooks of energy. And it's published again by the International Energy Agency, and it's appeared every year since 1998. So they really have a great set of data. It provides sort of the insights into global energy supply and demand, and all the different scenarios and implications for energy security, climate targets, and economic development. So what we're looking at right now in front of us is their latest graph on what global emissions look like from 2000 to 2050. If we look at the gray line all the way at the left, that really shows how emissions grew historically. And sort of at 2020, 2021 is when we start getting into the different scenarios. And I chose to share this with the group just to show how much of a endeavor we really all have to get to net zero by 2050. Sometimes when I read the news or when I see things, it seems like we're almost there. And, it's going to be fast and they're promising that, it's going to be right here, right now. But it's really, it's going to be a journey, and it's going to take a lot of not only investment, but of governments and companies really deciding how we're going to accelerate certain technologies. So the dark purple line that you see running all the way to the top, it's called pre-Paris baseline. That's if the world had continued to produce emissions before the Paris Accords that were met earlier in this decade. Where we are today is in the blue space, so since Paris 2015. And as you can see, since Paris 2015, things have sort of evened out. But there's ample room through 2050 of where we can go with the emissions. I mean, that's a big range. Recently, there were some pledges made by governments in Glasgow, in Scotland, to further reduce emissions. We have to see if we meet those pledges. But even if we meet those pledges, it's still not enough to get us to net zero by 2050, which is what the world is looking at in order to mitigate the biggest possible effects of climate change. And the green area is what I want to focus on, to just really show how much needs to be done before we can get to net zero by 2050. So it is a heck of a challenge that's going on, and really like a very big thing we need to do. But even with that, I mean, it's important to highlight just how much the world has decided to do by looking at the blue area. I mean, look how much emissions we're looking at to reduce since Paris 2015. And to get the world to do that, I mean, that's a lot. So the IEA has sort of 4 key takeaways of what we can do to really ensure that we get to net zero. So the 4 key takeaways they had in this year's report was, first, there needs to be a massive push for clean electrification. And that's really ensuring that power generation becomes much cleaner. Because most of our carbon emissions, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, don't quote me, but 60 to 70% come from power generation. And so what's that going to require, right? Because everything has a number. You got to double the amount of solar and wind deployment. Not an easy thing to do, but you got to double that. There needs to be a major expansion of other low emission generation. And that's going to include things like nuclear, where it's acceptable. A lot of people can have a perception that nuclear technology, nuclear power generation is dangerous. But it's actually one of the cleanest and most reliable sources of power generation. You need a build out of electricity infrastructure, and that means like transmission, because when you build solar, it's very far usually away from your markets where you need the electricity. So you need to build out transmission. You need to build out hydropower, phase out coal, and coal is one of the dirtiest power generation sort of things, and then drive the expansion of electricity for transport and heating. So that's really the single most important thing they highlighted in the report. Then on our side, what can we do? It's all about energy efficiency. You need technologies to really help moderate energy use and how we make things, because energy efficiency, like, we can really do our part. So that's another big thing in all this equation. Will people be willing to not have their air conditioning at a certain temperature because we need to drive energy efficiency? Will people be willing to invest in their homes and sort of the expenses around that to make your house more energy efficient? Then from the sector I work in, it's cutting methane emissions. And there needs to be a really rapid reduction in reducing methane, because methane is one of the sort of biggest greenhouse gases that exists. And finally, it's a boost in energy innovation, because that green sort of band that we see on the graph, half of the technologies that can get us to net zero in 2050, they're only in the demonstration or the prototype stage. So there's a big, big sort of gap where we still need to innovate in order to get to where we want to get to. I apologize if that was a lot, but as I told you in the beginning, I'm very fascinated by this sort of stuff. So any questions or any takeaways when anybody saw this graph? All right. Next one.
Wait, I have a. Oh wait, sorry, we have one other question. Our classmate Maya, excuse me.
Hey, Maya.
Hi. So I'm Maya, as Taruk introduced. So my question is, you mentioned geothermal energy investments and the doubling of wind and solar. So from Chevron's or your personal perspective, what renewable energy technology looks to have the brightest future in terms of the most sustainable transition source?
So Maya, all of those technologies are good technologies. And where I personally see, sort of from what I've learned in my time at the company, it's really going to be up to the market to decide who the winner is, right? The source that can provide the cheapest and most reliable power ultimately will be the best. And from what I've seen, it's a combination of all of them. Electricity demand, or sort of the electricity equation, you need reliable energy, and then you need electricity generation that can meet like certain peaks. Where wind and solar, for example, have an opportunity to improve, because geothermal and hydropower, the great thing that they have, it's always producing. The water is always moving through the dam, unless it doesn't rain, but the water is always moving through the dam. And geothermal, sort of that steam from the earth, is always moving through the turbine that generates power. But wind and solar, at night, the sun doesn't shine. And Taruk alluded to this earlier in one of his points. And the wind's not always blowing at the speed that you want it to. So how do you mitigate for that variability between what you expected to generate and what you actually generated? And that's battery storage. The thing with battery storage right now that we're seeing is that there is still not a battery technology that gets you to the level of reliability that you need. You can have it, but it's still all being developed. So it's very exciting what's happening, and I'm very excited to see what when we get there. So I hope that answered your question, Maya.
Yes, thank you.
I see two other hands. Stefan, do you want me to call on them?
Yes, please go ahead. Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah. Allison.
Hi there. I'm Allison. I actually have a friend here who's watching with me as well. She has a question for you.
Yeah, sure.
Hi, thank you. I was just wondering how Chevron personally wants to engage in these clean energy practices and how the company plans to move to engaging into these without negatively impacting a business model that's reliant on non-renewable energy.
Yeah, and that's a great question. So I don't know if you had heard earlier, but so we just stood up a new organization. It's called Chevron New Energies. And that's an organization that's focused on really investing in these new energies. So we've committed to the market, or we've publicly told the market that we're committing $10 billion through 2028 in investing in these technologies, and $10 billion is a significant amount. Which of the technologies? That's what that group is dedicated to looking at, but it's things like carbon capture and underground storage that helps mitigate carbon emissions from your operations, and you store them underground. It's hydrogen is a very exciting sort of new space. Hydrogen will help cut emissions from heavy sectors that are hard to mitigate for emissions, sort of heavy transportation like trucks. Steel production, cement production, fertilizer production, and sort of emissions from refineries. And then geothermal. Geothermal is another one. It provides reliable energy at a low cost. So those are the technologies that sort of right now we're looking at. But it's not only investing in those technologies, it's how do you partner with them. And sort of in certain field operations, we partner with renewable energy companies to source our power from solar, to source our power from wind. And that allows you to not use generators, because where we operate in some of these places, it's very remote. And you need something to drive, your operations. And so instead of using a diesel generator, you use electricity. But what type of electricity do you use? You sign an agreement with a clean energy company or a renewable energy company to use their power. So that's sort of what we're looking at.
That's really interesting. So are you hoping that, or foreseeing the revenue from these partnerships and investments will offset the business as you move away from non-renewable energy sources?
So we're gonna need all types of energy for the foreseeable future, right? It's just demand for products. Demand for products is going to continue for a long time, just because of where the products we produce in our base business, how they're used just in the modern world. And when it comes to revenue and all of that, I don't have the answer to that. I'm the international relations guy. That's more, I think, for the finance people. But all of the investments we make are really heavily scrutinized, and you have to see, what the business case is for them. And so far, I haven't seen that we've made a bad business case investment. I really trust the company to be really looking at all these things. So thank you.
Thank you.
Andre, how's it going?
She kind of asked the same question that I had, basically, like, what was Chevron doing? So I'll redirect my question a little bit. Sure. It's pretty. Chevron has the resources to lobby and sort of make effects at the national and even international level, and so these sort of things. So the way I'm going to redirect my question is, what is Chevron going to do to change the people, the opinion of the common folk? Like, how are they going to show up at the local level and educate people on what are acceptable things to do, and what sort of alternate energy solutions?
Yeah, and that's really through having conversations. Honestly, I mean, we do that every day in the places where we operate, and we really try to have a two-way dialogue with the communities where we operate in. And it's really about showing, one, the benefits of having reliable and affordable energy, but also, again, this messaging that we need all types of energy. And what we really need is the market to decide what are the energies that are going to be used. And I think having that two-way dialogue is what's been really constructive, because the perspectives that we might have here, and this is where the international relations background, I think, is key. The perspectives that we have here are very different from perspectives that might be had in other countries. The world is continuing to develop, and as countries develop, people are going to want reliable and affordable energy. And the US, we have this great, very privileged position that we're much more advanced in our development than other areas. And so the conversations really change depending on where you are. So you really have to adapt to the market where you're at. And for the US, the conversation looks very different than the conversations we have, for example, in like my home country, in Venezuela, where people have different needs. And so that's how you approach it. It's really at the local level and adapting to what your market participants might be needing.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Andre. Julian?
Hello. Thank you. I had a question. We've already briefly spoken about like nuclear energy.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about the emerging technology of fusion energy and how that sort of might produce energy security, sustainable energy security for the future. Well, a lot of different countries, however, I do see it becoming an issue, especially with countries like Iran, whose nuclear program is controversial, and the most recent issue at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in Ukraine, how those sort of dynamics play out and whether or not that's a cause for concern, especially in developing countries who may already be in a state of military conflict.
Yeah, and that's a great perspective, Julian, and thank you for bringing that into the conversation. A nuclear technology, again, is one of the cleanest and most reliable forms of power generation that exists. And this is, again, from my perspective, but you can do the reading on it, as some of you have, and really it's very reliable and very clean. When it comes to nuclear fusion, Chevron, actually, we have a venture capital arm called Chevron Technology Ventures that invests in emerging technologies. And we've actually invested in a nuclear fusion startup. But like a lot of these things, sort of like what the International Energy Agency was saying, a lot of these technologies are in the sort of startup and research phase. So it's going to take a long time to see which ones are going to be the winners and which ones develop and you're actually able to scale at a market level to make them, really usable around the world. When it comes to safety of it all and how different countries are depending on their sort of, like you said, environment, politically and geopolitically, and that really is country by country decision. Most countries will invest based on, again, affordability and reliability, and nuclear just might not be an option for some countries just because of the expense, because of the complexity, and because of what's required to get there. But advanced markets like Europe and the US, it's very much a technology that we could and that has potential, really, if we're committed to this sort of green energy transition. A nuclear is an excellent technology, and it's very reliable, and that's important when it comes to our electricity. We need reliability. So thank you, Julian, for bringing that perspective into the conversation.
Thank you for elaborating.
All right. Shall we go to the next slide, Stefan? And I think we may have talked a little bit about this. I might have alluded to it, but I wanted to show sort of what the demand projections look like for oil and gas. And we see, let's talk about the oil scenario on the left. So again, the gray line is what we've seen historically happen. The blue line shows the demand for oil, how it continues to grow given the policies that we have. So again, what I was talking about when I read the news or when I see things, that it just seems like our transition is about to get there. But the reality is the world is going to continue using these products past 2030. And with the policies that we have already, you see that the oil demand line, the blue line, continues to grow. The yellow line is the announced pledges. That is, if countries make their sort of stated pledges that they made in Glasgow, and if we reach that, you see oil demand evens out and then starts declining and to even out again in 2030. And finally, the green line is the net zero scenario. And I really want to highlight that to show, imagine how difficult it's going to be, or if it's even realistic to imagine, suddenly dropping oil demand that dramatically by 2030. How would we retool our manufacturing processes? How would we retool the things that we use in our day-to-day life to get to that point? And it just highlights the complexity and the difficulty at a global scale of what the energy transition looks like. The interesting thing in the report, though, looking at the oil side, is that this is the first time in the report where oil demand goes into decline across all of the scenarios eventually. This only goes to 2030, but by 2050 in all of them, you see oil demand declines because that's how the world is transitioning. On the right is natural gas. Natural gas in all of the scenarios continues to increase over the next 5 years, but there's a divergence in how fast it drops down. There's a lot of factors that go into that, but basically how long natural gas is going to be used and retains its place in the energy sector as a transition fuel, that just really depends on how governments decide and how industry decides and how the market decides that the energy transition is going to look like. Because natural gas is sort of this bridge fuel because it's reliable, it's affordable, and it's used as a feedstock for a lot of processes that we have today. And so, yeah, that's why the demand drop or the demand increase sort of varies in the different scenarios. And really, the outlook, I mean, this is at a global level, but if we were to focus it in at a regional level, we are going to see completely different outcomes. Because in advanced markets, you know, efficiencies on our side, again, our homes, how we use our power, and then electrification, electric cars, electric trucks, all that sort of stuff, you would see this curve look, you know, much steeper in an advanced market. But again, the deployment of these low emission technologies in advanced markets is really off track. Hydrogen, for example, there's a really big interest right now from the industry I work in and from others to develop hydrogen. But the pipeline of planned projects and how the technology is going to work, how the economics around it are going to work, it really falls short of the 2030 pledges that have been announced by governments. And it really falls short of the net zero sort of by 2050 pledges that we need. I mean, there's a 9-time difference in the gap of current projects to what we actually need now to reach net zero. And that's where markets and industry, Stefan was saying it at the beginning, you know, who sets the market, right? Who sets energy policy? I had mentioned the market does, but governments can influence that. And sort of for hydrogen, for example, is where really industry, where government can be helpful to industry, because if you incentivize it, you can really help provide incentives and help for companies to be able to develop these technologies and to develop them in an economically, in a way where the economics work. Because when technologies are emerging and you don't have help or support from government institutions, it becomes very difficult to make the business case for investing in that, because your investors are going to want what you know and what works and what provides returns. So that's where I was telling Stefan that governments can be really useful in sort of setting the market for energy transition and helping these technologies advance. Any questions on this? All right, next slide, please. And this is finally where we really get to the, I think, crux of the energy transition and what's going on. On the right-hand side, you see the graph for oil and gas investment. You can see that's pretty stable. On the right, what was most surprising for me is the green bar on the right-hand side. Look at the difference between 2020 and that 2022 through 2030 bar. You need almost 3.5 times the investment in billions or trillions of dollars in order to meet the net zero scenario by 2030. Can you imagine, or can I imagine, how much you need to coordinate, how much you need to move governments to get to that level, I mean, it is very, very large. And that's the fascinating thing about all of this, is how do we get there, and can we even get there? Because you need a lot of political will to get to that. And people really need to, you would need to do a lot of changes very quickly. And sometimes society doesn't like changes very quickly. And that's where this sort of energy transition, what it ends up looking like, it's fascinating. I mean, the IEA states the world is not investing enough to meet its future energy needs. And these uncertainties between policy and demand, like how demand is going and what policies are going to look like, it really creates a strong risk for energy markets and for prices and for what people will be seeing in our day-to-day life. Transition spending, so energy transition technology spending, is picking up, but it's far short of what we need to meet rising demand for energy in a sustainable way. The IEA has recommended over and over again that a surge is needed in spending to deploy clean energy technologies and infrastructure that can help us get out of this sort of volatile period. But we need to do it quickly, or markets and the electricity sector are really going to face a turbulent time ahead. And imagine how that turbulence reflects, and it's sort of like throwing a pebble into the water. Like, what do those ripples look like? And this system that we create is going to need to operate flexibly, have adequate capacity. You need your grid, your electricity grid, to be robust. And again, battery storage and dispatchable low emission sources of electricity like hydropower, geothermal, hydrogen, etc., in order to really get to a net zero scenario. And you're also going to require digital technologies that can support sort of demand side response and make sure that people are using their energy efficiently. But all of this at the global level, we reach the sort of thing. What does that do to trade? What does that do for geopolitics? That's really important to consider in the energy security conversation, because we might want to shift to electrified, sort of renewable focused world. But imagine we put all this money into it. What does that do for mineral prices, right? Suddenly you're going to have this surge in demand for lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, rare earth elements. Countries that have those, they're going to be the new sort of geopolitical kings or queens. But the price of all of that in the short term is going to skyrocket or just go up, because to develop a mine for lithium, that takes a number of years between the permitting, the development, the production, and finally getting that to market. And that's the thing with the energy transition. We see us building more solar, we see us developing more wind, but at the scale that we need, prices of certain things are going to get very expensive. And that could slow down the progress for a cleaner energy future, because it's going to impact companies' decisions and their economics on these projects. The IEA estimates, for example, that just in 2021, because of the surge we have now, which is not at the scale that we need, but that little surge in 2021, already solar modules, wind turbines, and electric vehicle batteries are up in cost by up to 15%. And that really affects the economics of your project. So all that to say is that there's a lot of uncertainty, and just really there is a massive push that needs to be made. But how do the economics of all of that work? And seeing how that plays out, I think it leaves me at least with a lot of questions, and it'll be very fascinating to see how all of that happens. And that's the beauty of geopolitics and why I really like international relations. So yeah, that's it on this slide. Any questions? I see Julian Julian, you have your hand up. Go ahead, Julian.
Thank you. I was thinking back to what you said about the process of transition to clean renewable energy sources, and this sort of what Europe is currently going through, and the economic projections they have for the winter when their energy needs skyrocket in the face of these Russian sanctions and the gas that's no longer flowing in the way it used to. Um, the EU commissioner is reaching out to Azerbaijan to hopefully get some investments so they could get natural gas from Azerbaijan. What sorts of geopolitical changes do you foresee when the crisis really hits home in Europe come this winter?
Yeah, and honestly, my heart goes out to the people of Ukraine. I mean, what's happening there it's not something you want to see. I think the world hadn't seen what we're seeing today since the Second World War. I mean, a land war in Europe. Yeah, it's something that I didn't expect to see in my life. But what that has shown is just the importance of having reliable fuel and reliable energy sources in your country where you produce or in your region. Because whether I like it or not, geopolitical realities are what they are. And the United States, for example, has done a very good job at developing all forms of energy. And it's that allows the US to enjoy the comfort of, if anything happens, we have domestic oil and natural gas production to get us through things. Europe has chosen a different path, and that is okay. However, when it comes to these geopolitical realities, that's where it's like, okay, it shows the need to have just affordable energy being produced at home, even while you're transitioning. You need something to get you through that. So rather than, hoping, we want to get here, so let's abandon or let's start reducing what we already produce. It just shows that you can maintain what you have while building this out, sort of the future of energy. And then once you're there, that's when you can wind down everything else. Because if not, you expose yourself, I think, you expose yourself to something like this, where a country like Russia can cut off your gas and say, well, good luck. And that causes a lot of difficulties for your citizens. So that's the fascinating geopolitical challenge with the energy transition.
Thank you.
What'll happen? I wish I had a crystal ball. I mean, personally, what I think this has done, it's really reinforced the Western alliance. The importance of NATO is again at the forefront. Seeing the United States work to support its partners in Europe is incredible, and you'll see Europe now work with different countries to secure a reliable source of gas, because they still need gas to heat their people's homes, and they need gas for their industry and for their manufacturing. Because again, high energy costs leads to high food costs, high product costs. I mean, it goes all down the value chain to the things we see in our day to day. And Europe will need that in the short term, but in the long term, what this has shown is the importance again of having your own domestic energy. And that'll probably increase the speed of the renewables transition for Europe. So they need a bridge right now, but for their transition, it'll just highlight to countries just how important it is for you to have your own domestic energy sort of production, so you don't rely on maybe partners that might not be reliable, like Russia.
Gotcha. I do have one follow-up question on that. Europe gets a lot of their energy from natural gas. Mm-hmm. And so there's been a lot of discussion about liquefied natural gas terminals. that Europe is lacking, so that way they could get energy from the US? What sorts of infrastructure projects do you see either upcoming or already in the pipeline to get more LNG terminals up and running in Europe, so that way they could be supplied more energy? Because Europe, as countries themselves, most countries in Europe, they don't produce a lot of energy. So.
Right. Yeah, Julian. And there, I can't speak to specific projects, but I'll speak sort of more broadly, if that's okay with you. So yeah, LNG terminals are big investments that need to be made. But the other things that you can start seeing that'll increase sort of your energy security, it's going to be pipeline interconnections. So, for example, the west of Europe, Portugal and Spain, they get their gas from Algeria, mostly from Algeria. And for a long time, there was a lot of hesitance in the EU from certain members of building a pipeline that would connect that Spain and Portugal pipeline to the rest of Europe. Now, Spain and Portugal are enjoying security of their supply, and Europe has decided, okay, let's build that pipeline finally, so that source of gas gets to the rest of the continent. You see that in the Eastern Mediterranean. A lot of proposals were made for pipelines that could connect the new Eastern Mediterranean gas fields in Egypt, Israel, and we just announced that we're moving Chevron. We just announced that we're moving forward with development of the Aphrodite field in Cyprus. Cyprus is an EU member, and as that supply gets built out and starts producing, that also leads to energy security. So that's in sort of the world that I move in. In the new energies space, you're going to see an increased build out, and funding for projects like solar. You're going to see, recently the CEO of a major renewable energy company in Europe said that the Russian invasion is going to lead to 30 extra gigawatts of potential offshore wind energy. So you're going to see more build out of offshore wind energy. There's going to be a catalyst now for green hydrogen production, or the build out of electrolyzers, and sort of what green hydrogen starts developing on the continent. So that's Europe is really, if you want to see the energy transition happening live and what it looks like and the effects that happen because of it, look at Europe, because in the next couple of years it's going to be a fascinating space for all of that and how it plays out. So thank you, Julian. Any other questions on this slide? All right, let's go to the last slide. So just to conclude, like I said at the beginning, but I'll repeat myself, that's just a little piece of the world energy outlook. It looks at everything from coal demand, oil, natural gas, renewables. Earlier, there was a question, I believe it was from Allison's friend, that talked about sort of the economics of renewable energy projects. The report has a whole section dedicated to renewables and what solar, wind, hydro, nuclear projects economics look like and the development for those. And so that's why if you have any further questions on the specifics and the economics, that's a great place, and I believe it's a great resource. So I've included the link here. Happy, maybe we can share it in the chat as well. But if not, the link is in the presentation. And that's it. I really appreciate everybody's time and for giving me the space to be able to share some thoughts with you. And I really have enjoyed the questions. I don't know if there's any other questions or what we do next, but Stefan, you let me know.
Thank you, Guillermo. So we do have a few questions that have been submitted to me. Before we do that, though, I would like to take a group photo, if everyone's okay with that. So I'll ask if you all could please turn your videos on. Alrighty. All right, came out great. So yeah, so we have received a few questions. Let me just pull the chat back up. First question we have is from Taruk Wheeler.
Thank you. And thank you for your time today, Mr. Van Maanen.
Yeah, no, Guillermo's fine, Taruk.
Guillermo. I wanted to ask you how your experience in international affairs has helped the companies such as Chevron deal with the instabilities in the markets, such as, again, Venezuela, as what we've seen. And would it be more of a lobbyist or more of a consultancy to the company, either dealing with different governmental organizations or just consulting the company themselves? Thank you.
Yeah, and that's one of those things where I remember during the research process of looking at different companies, it was like, all right, like what do I bring? I'm going to expand it to just say we, in the sense of like, I believe the majority of us here are very interested in the field of international relations and all of that. But again, I think it's, as the world continues to advance, the expectations on companies from stakeholders outside of just the market and investors continue to grow. And nothing against them, but engineers might not necessarily have the perspectives that we have. MBA students might not necessarily have the perspectives that we have. They're very good for markets, for investors, and for getting from A to B on the engineering side. But how we get from A to B is sort of stakeholder perspectives. What are sort of above ground risks? How do we profile those risks? How do those risks and how do those stakeholders interact at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level? And then what are the geopolitical trends? How does a decision we make today going to reverberate across the markets where we operate in? And that's, I think, the beauty of like what we can really offer. How does that look in practice? It depends on the company. The company I work for has a whole group. It's called Corporate Affairs. That's a very, just personal opinion, a very corporate name that you can be like, well, what does that do? So what we do is we do policy work, we do public affairs work, communications, and then government affairs. And most of my colleagues in there, it's really their sort of international relations, comms sort of focused people. And so, yeah, so you can have an effect on a lot of different parts of the company. How I've seen it in practice has been really, for me in my career, it's been at sort of a generalist level. I really like working in the business regions. And so I've worked supporting the North American business, doing everything from key messaging development for executives to briefing books on like what a country entry project looks like. I remember it's public now, it's in the news, so I can talk about it. But years ago, 2015, my boss suddenly came up to me and was like, Guillermo, I need you to write a report on what a divesting from the offshore Morocco oil and gas market would look like. I was like, okay. Why? It's confidential. Don't worry about it. Just write the report. And so I wrote the report, and it wasn't until a year and a half later that I saw the news article from Reuters, breaking news, Chevron exits Morocco offshore oil field. And I was like, oh, that's what it was for. But those perspectives that I got to put in the report helped him sit down at the table with our engineers, with our business people, and with our business development sort of group, and really make sure that the country exit process worked in a way where stakeholders were satisfied and where the market was satisfied. And that's, I think, the value that we can add and how I've seen it in practice. Now, I work directly in government affairs, so I do speak more directly with the government. I'm in Texas, so I cover Texas now. But I'm talking directly with stakeholders and helping them see perspectives and being useful for them, and how can we, have a two-way dialogue. So that's what I do.
Great, thank you so much.
No, thank you, Taruk.
Guillermo, I do believe Taruk mentioned Venezuela, and I think Venezuela in history has been an interesting case because, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that I remember a few years ago when they had their energy crisis. Um, that was partly due to their focus on hydroelectric power, right?
So yes, Venezuela has a very large dam, the Guri Dam, that was one of the main sources of power generation. Correct.
So my main question is, what are the dangers? Like, so what? When these, like, when countries, when nations are deciding to switch to new energy sources, what, if any, are the dangers of switching or focusing, putting your eggs too much in one basket? Is it important to diversify your energy?
It is. It's super important to have an all of the above energy approach. That's how I've heard the market called it and the corporate world called it. But that means having a diversified energy portfolio, like Stefan said. Why do we want that? You want that, one, to meet societal sort of goals of having cleaner, low emission energy. But the reality of, you need also reliable, dispatchable energy. And dispatchable means that if something turns off or something didn't operate like you needed it to, like the wind didn't blow as hard as you thought it was going to blow, you need something to turn on to meet that gap between demand and supply. As we move forward, I'll talk about the Texas market as an example. The pipeline of projects that I see in Texas now for power generation are mostly renewable energy projects. Why is that? Well, it's very understandable. There's federal incentives for renewables. There's state incentive for renewables. It's very cheap power, and it's cost efficient to build. The thing is that the more renewable generation you bring onto the grid, the less the economics work for your natural gas turbines, your coal-fired power plants, and sort of the sources that are dispatchable. While that is good because we're cleaning up our energy generation, it leads to issues where volatility becomes more and more dangerous, because if your solar doesn't produce how you expected it to, if your wind doesn't blow like you expected it to, you suddenly might have a gap between supply and demand. And when you have a gap, then you need to start shutting off power, because if you destabilize the grid, then you have a blackout and there goes your grid. And that's why it's important to continue incentivizing, and for the market to incentivize, or governments to help maintain or create incentives for dispatchable generation, because that dispatchable generation is the bridge between the volatility of your renewables and the actual demand for electricity. Of course, on our end, on the demand side, you can make buildings more efficient. You can install smart meters in your house to regulate the temperature for you. There you enter into a question of, well, what if I like my air conditioning at 68? The electricity grid should be able to accommodate that. So, there you start entering into those types of questions. But those sorts of demand side response for efficiency and to lower power demand, that also takes a while to build out. Retrofitting buildings is not something, I can't retrofit my house from today to tomorrow. Supplying, like getting the materials, getting a builder out there, like fixing everything, that takes time. So what we can actually do now is continue to have dispatchable generation like natural gas turbines in order to meet that gap, should it, when it happens. And then once we figure out renewables with battery storage attached to them so that they can produce consistently, like when they promise us, 5 megawatts of energy, I'm using a random number, 5 megawatts of energy, that it actually is 5 megawatts of energy. The other thing, and I know this answer is getting long, but the other thing is transmission. Transmission is not sexy. Sexy is seeing the headline, we built out a big wind field, or we built out a big solar field. Amazing. The market loves that. People love that. It feels good. But how does that energy get to your market where I need my power? And that's through transmission. And people kind of forget about that. Transmission infrastructure today doesn't have the capacity to transmit 100% of the electrons produced by my wind or solar field to the market. Natural gas turbines get, close to 90, 85%, but because they're built right next to the market. So the transmission doesn't have to go far. The electron isn't going far to get to where it needs to be. But when you're in Texas, when you're producing wind energy in the panhandle of Texas, so it would be like being in the panhandle of Florida to get the energy all the way down to Miami, you lose about 35 to 40% of what was actually produced. And that's where the governments can come in and really focus on building high technology transmission, the sort of next generation of transmission, because that will help you reduce the losses from source to market. And that's really important.
Wonderful, thank you. So I'd like to give everyone a chance if you have any other questions. Kyle, I do know you have a question, but I'd like to leave yours for the very end. Anyone have any questions that they haven't sent over? Okay, then Kyle, we'd like to send it over to you to ask your question.
Absolutely, and thank you, Guillermo, for your wonderful discussion today of the energy industry and how that relates to international relations and all the issues and opportunities that arise from that. The question that I wanted to ask is, what advice would you give for emerging leaders moving into the international relations field?
Sure. It's a really good question, because honestly, like, even still after being in the energy industry for going on 8 years, I'm still looking for advice myself and asking like my mentors, what it is that like I can do. I think the best advice that I got was really the international relations space is one where it doesn't matter where you're from, like you can participate in it. And I think like we add so much value to any type of company that it's really about not limiting yourself to a certain space. If there's a space that you're really passionate about, go for it. But companies nowadays need so much perspective with this, and it's only going to be more and more important to be involved in it. And I found the best place to get involved in that was either starting at a multinational sort of institution. I mean, looking at things like the State Department, look at the UN. I mean, these agencies on the government side, or find a consulting firm, a lobbying firm that works with those partners, because that helps me build out sort of the perspective, like when I was an intern, build out the perspective of what is it that the government, how does it operate? What's it looking at? Like, what is important? And then, I saw that companies needed or were looking for this sort of type of expertise and these skills. And you can really be in the private sector, you can really be an agent of change and really like an advocate for industry and for companies. And it's just as fascinating as a traditional foreign service officer role in the State Department or working at the UN, because we work with governments every day, and you get to sit down and have actual conversations on like, hey, what are your priorities? Like what are we looking at, and how can we like be a partner for you? And then the other thing is reading, in the sense of like staying up to date with news, with market trends, with what's going on, and participating in forums like this, chatting, getting your voice out there, networking. It's I think our business is really one of network and the power of information, but not only talking to people, but being able to listen. My boss has really taught me the importance of empathy and being able to listen to different perspectives, because I would have assumed that in this sector, it's all about, I'll take the US market, for example, but aligning with people that have our same perspective. But that doesn't really get you anywhere, because you're just talking to yourself. Where I found the most rewarding conversations have happened in my career is when I've been with managers, and when I've been on projects that allowed me to meet with people who had a completely different perspective. I'll give an example in my current role. In my first Texas legislative session, my boss told me I was going to have a lot of fun because my portfolio was mainly comprised of Democrats who were urban and didn't have any oil and gas production in their districts, right? So they have very different stakeholder needs. And I remember my first time walking into one office where the legislative director looked at me and was like, "Who are you?" And I'm like, "Hi, I'm Guillermo. I work for Chevron." "Oh, how does it feel to work for a company that kills people?" And I was like, "Thank God it's 5 o'clock. Let's sit down and have a drink and give me more of your perspective on that." Being open to the conversation and listening to this person tell me their perspectives led to an hour-long just conversation around it, where I was like, why would I work for a company that does that? I want a future for my children. It's like when we get on a plane, the pilot doesn't want the plane to crash. They really want to get back home. And it's the same thing I want. And this person and I were able to start from this dialogue where they felt listened to, and they heard things that they didn't know, because a lot of international relations professionals in my field, they sort of just go in, hand them a piece of paper, like, this is what's important, that's what you need, thank you so much. But they don't take the time to listen and build the relationship. And I've been very lucky to learn from a boss that does that. And that paid dividends, because this person learned some new things. And then we just established a constant dialogue. And I was like, how can I help you with your legislative priorities? They had nothing to do with what was important for like what I was working on at the time. But I was willing to be an advocate to connect that office with other offices, with resources, with just like, hey, like just stuff that might be interesting. And that led to a whole relationship where really like it was super helpful, because I got different perspectives that helped me make certain decisions that I needed to, that got me business outcomes that were valuable. And I built just a very good relationship with a powerful Democratic office. And that's like just sort of being able to listen and empathy. That I think gets us very far in our field, because everybody's perspective is valid. You might not agree on everything, but at the end of the day, like, we can agree to work together on stuff. And that's what I love about the field.
Wonderful. Well, Guillermo, thank you. Those are some really great words to close the session with. I want to thank you for coming, Guillermo. I mean, we've known each other a long time, and it's really great to be able to have you, maybe not in person, but come back to the South Florida community. We've missed you down here, and just really share your wisdom, your knowledge, and just your experience. It's been a really illuminating opportunity just to hear this all. So to all of you, thank you so much for joining us. I also want to thank my partners, Walter Poik and Corey Hancock. I want to thank our partners in the FAU community. And I want to let you guys know that we are going to hopefully see you soon next month. We're looking to have Ambassador Pickering join us again for what will be the start of an annual event with him, where we're going to be trying something new. Ambassador Pickering is essentially going to do like a Socratic method classroom with you guys, where he will submit several questions or statements about current events or a specific issue he wants to talk about. You guys will then have the opportunity to expand on those statements, give your opinion about what's going on. He'll then use the Socratic method to really try to challenge you on these thoughts that you guys had. Really force you to see the different perspectives, kind of like what Guillermo was just talking about with just listening to other points of view, considering them, maybe not agreeing with them, but factoring them into your own view of how things work. So we're looking to get that set for October 15th. I'll give you guys more information on that. I'll send you guys the picture that we took. I'll also look to get this video up on YouTube. And I will share the link to the report that Guillermo has mentioned. I want to thank you guys so much for coming. Enjoy your week. I know there's a hurricane coming, so hopefully we miss it. But have a great time, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. I really appreciate your time, and thank you for the questions as well. I learned a lot about you, and that's always the exciting part. Thank you.